I want to say that the context and circumstances are very different. The responsiveness of the system and the institutions to protests are vastly different, but still there are important parallels and lessons to be drawn. First, there's always a trigger. I mean, it took the murder of George Floyd, captured graphically on video, and a pandemic that disproportionately killed Black and brown people here in the US, for enraged citizens, Americans, to take to the streets to protest against injustices that had been festering for decades, if not more. First, systematic racism and inequality, the militarization of policing and law enforcement that often sees communities of color as the enemy, the systematic poverty and the huge wealth gap between Blacks and other minorities and white Americans, and one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world that affects Black people disproportionately, and other grievances, and all of these grievances and injustices are linked, as the Reverend William J. Barber said here in the U.S. After the protests started. He calls them the interlocking injustices. So the trigger here in the US, and in the same way, I mean, the Floyd murder and the pandemic were the trigger here in the US, there were also triggers in the Arab world over the past decade of protests since December 2010. In Tunisia, it was Hamad Bouazizi setting himself on fire because he couldn't find work that unleashed people on the streets. In Egypt, it was the photos of Khalid Said, his disfigured body after he was tortured to death by police in the summer of 2010. In Syria, it was the arrest and torture of the children in Dara for scrawling, subversive anti-regime graffiti on a school wall. And in Libya, it was the arrest of the human rights activist Fethi Terbil. And then people across the Arab world were watching each other. And this triggered protests in Yemen, in Bahrain, and elsewhere, in Iraq, if you remember as well, in Lebanon, briefly. So the same way, the Floyd killing triggered protests, mass protests in France, in the UK, and other parts of the world. So people are watching each other. Obviously, each country, each Arab country had its own circumstances and varying degrees of oppression. But overall, I mean, the underlying causes were pretty much similar. This lack of justice, this lack of dignity, a system serving the rulers and their cronies, this sense of marginalization by many segments of the populations, poverty, lack of economic opportunities, corruption on every level, coloring every facet of people's lives. The opportunities and rights that average citizens have depend on their proximity to power. And people muzzled and oppressed for decades by different means, including, brutal police state apparatuses. And also, one of the tricks of in the Arab world was to divide and conquer, basically instilling fear in citizens of one another. And even in the second wave of the, I agree with Chris, maybe if we call it Arab Spring 2.0, it's oversimplifying it, but let's call them the second wave of protests in 2018, 19, and 20. Places like Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, Iraq. There was also a trigger. In Lebanon, it was, plans to impose a tax on WhatsApp messages. But obviously the grievances, ran much deeper than that in Lebanon. The second parallel between the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests in the Arab world is that they are led by the youth. It's incredible. I mean, it's exactly the same. Watching the youth here in America and watching the youth in the Arab world yearning to find their voice and identity. It's even the same talk of leaderless protests. I mean, I heard that here in America. of even the protesters having different demands. Some wanting to reform the system, some wanting to overhaul it completely, people talking about defunding the police. So similar dynamics in the Arab world, when the protests started. Even the slogans, I mean, the third parallel would be the slogans, the no justice, no peace, I can't breathe. I mean, they have their equivalents in the Arab world. Very important, the use of social media, of Facebook, of Twitter, very much the same. Even the tactics of the protesters are comparable. The blocking of streets, occupying sections of cities. We've seen that in a neighborhood in Seattle, the state of Washington, and we've also seen it in the capital, Washington, D.C., in Lafayette Park, across from the White House. The fifth parallel is the war of narratives. Those acting violently, burning police stations, looting, throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at the police are a small fraction of the protesters, both here in the US and also in the Arab world. But unfortunately, this is what really dominates the narrative and also dominates the TV screens. And we've seen it play out in a very similar fashion, both here and in the Arab world. And also, I would say, there are some parallels in the response, particularly in the era that we're living in here in the US. The parallels in the response by those in power, at least in the first few days and weeks in America. The president was, and some of the governors were calling for the army to be sent in. The protesters were described, quote unquote, as infiltrators, as terrorists, as quote unquote lowlives. I mean, it could have been Assad or Gaddafi talking, you wondered. But obviously there were no shoot to kill orders in the US, thankfully. But we all saw, the extreme violence that was deployed in some cities to quell the protests. And obviously the National Guard was deployed, and even Trump was contemplating sending in, combat troops, active duty troops, as happened in several Arab countries before he was restrained by, retired generals and the Pentagon itself at some point. The seventh area where I see parallels is also the polarized and divided society. The loyalists and the opponents, a very similar dynamic. I mean, those loyal to the leader, both here in the US and the Arab world, do not believe what's happening. They see the other, the protester, as the enemy, the traitor, almost subhuman, which would justify, beating him or her, or whoever is protesting. So I see similar dynamics there. Even the use of religion, I would say there are parallels. In the Arab world, a lot of the leaders came out and proclaimed that if you're protesting, then you are not a good, quote unquote, not a good Muslim, because you're not obeying what's called in Islam, Wali al-Amr, the guardian. A similar fashion here in the US, when President Trump stood in front of that church and held up the Bible, the underlying message was, if you're protesting, then you're not a good Christian.